democracy is the politics of hope. I mean, that's how a lot of people think of it. And it's the hope for a better society. And in the work group just now, I mentioned my PhD, which was undertaken in 1980. Okay. 1980, 81 to 84, something like that. And it was focused in and around a school not too far away from where we are, more towards Liverpool, where the unemployment levels were massive. The focus was on pastoral care, i.e. that the problems that the kids had were of sufficient importance that you could go directly and start talking about those problems with the kids, even working with the parents and so forth to solve problems. But it was an area of massive unemployment, but kind of aggregated, so that in certain patches, as one of the sort of local statisticians put it, there would be children who didn't know anyone who did work.
Okay. This was in the 80s?
This was in
Thatcherite kind of era?
Thatcherite time. So we're talking 1980, 1981, 1982. The heyday of this particular school was in the early 70s. So the school was beginning to decline somewhat in terms of its values.
Just to clarify, it's a state school?
It's a state school. I don't want to name it even now. But the issue for me really was in terms of dealing with the real problems and so forth of the community. That was its value set.
Okay.
Now, one evening, I'm elaborating the story as one does and gets into a story, is that after a parents' evening, we all went to the local pub and started talking, and one of the senior teachers basically started up a conversation that was saying, I saw Mrs. So-and-so the other day, and of course I went into her flat, and of course you saw the brown stains down the walls and so forth. And I was kind of getting lost at this point. I hadn't a clue what he was talking about. What do you mean, brown stains? So, all the plumbing in the entire building is blocked, so the toilet waste kind of dribbles down walls and so forth. And it's pretty usual. They bury it in the backyard and so forth. I just said, isn't there a way in which a school like this, that is about social values, community and so forth, can make this known? Isn't this a scandal? And the statement really was, and these are good-hearted teachers, these weren't nasty people, these were people who really cared. Now, the statement was, now the issue is, the local kids and the local people around here don't write letters. Okay. If we start stirring things up, of course you'll have violent revolution. They'll be fighting in the streets. That's the way they do things. Now our job is to keep the lid on the dustbin. That image has just sort of stayed with me for 30 years. It's in my first book called Maladjusted Schooling, which means schools maladjusted to the needs of people.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm picking up, but one of the things I'm definitely picking up from you is the idea that schools, who are they serving?
Who are they serving?
And would contrasting that serving
whose education is at stake here? And what do we mean by education? I mean, the whole framework for my thinking was really in terms of kids going through a process, 10 years or so, from when they entered school to when they left school, and at the end of their schooling, did they know any more about democratic practice? Did they know any more about how to change the conditions and circumstances of everyday lives such that they can make a real difference? In that community, an awful lot of people, young people leaving school, went straight onto the dole queue. They had no more understanding about how to make a difference in their society, as I say, than the day that they entered school. So what was the schooling about? And the question that I've been working with ever since, in terms of how does one actually go about making realistic reasonable changes within communities, i.e. that the young people themselves in community with their families and so forth are actually making the changes themselves.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions on that. Yeah. You said a minute ago about in the 80s, you described the school where the teachers said, even though they were kind-hearted teachers, still said, when faced with a social problem, our job is to keep a dustbin lid on it. Is it the case that, since then, the appearance of schools have changed? As we've been talking this morning a lot about some of the language in schools is about, participation and young people having a voice. And schools certainly seem to have become more, not keeping a lid on it, to be more, concerned with young people's development. To what extent is that just grounds for suspicion? I mean, to what extent is that concern for young people's development, and to what extent is it corporate training?
I'm ambivalent about all this. I want people's voices to be heard. I want real decision making to be taking place. Can I answer it with yet another anecdote? And the anecdote is really about a small primary school. No, it's not a primary school, it's a first school. And it was a school in East Anglia. And it took children from the age, because there was a nursery part to it as well, from about 3 years old up to about 7 years old. So they entered the real part of schooling at 5, of course. And then they went after age 7 to middle school, and then they went on to the upper school. Now, a new head teacher had come in, and this is now in the middle 80s. 1980s. A new head teacher had come into that school, and she was shocked to find queues of young kids, 4 years old, 5 years old, outside her office, having been sent there, not 4 years old, but 5 years old, having been sent there by the teachers because they'd been naughty. She said, "What's going on? This should not be happening. I've just come from a school in Hackney where there's serious problems and so forth, and yet people are talking about violence, aggression within this school here." And we set it up as a research problem, and it was based around an observation by a couple of the teachers of saying, well, the kids were being engaged in a fight. And 5, 10, 15 minutes later, you see them walking around hand in hand. Sure. How did they get from the fight to walking now around, returning to friendship? So the question is, so we treated it as a research issue. Okay, put a tape recorder on, sit them down and see how they sort it out. That actually became a structural strategy around the school as a whole. Every problem, whether it was a curriculum problem, whether it was, I want the red pencil now, but she's got the red pencil. And there's a real little fight over the resources, became a sorting out problem. They had to go off, sit down and talk about it. And talk about their feelings of being hurt by another person or whatever it was, and then come up with a solution about how they were then going to be able to manage what it was that they were going to do next. As I say, that affected every aspect of the life of the school. The teachers did the sorting out between themselves as well. I've got a problem with you, Mrs. So-and-so. And they would just simply talk it out in front of the kids, and so forth. Now, that enabled what I thought to be, as much as anything else, a democratic framework. And the democratic framework also enabled the children to start to construct their own curriculum. So, it started simply enough. Please, miss, I don't know what to do now because I've finished my work. Oh, that's an interesting problem. Have a think about it and come back to me with a solution to
Excellent,
it. And so the kids started to do that. So naturally that began to elaborate into them just simply developing their own projects.
Just one follow-up question there. With the idea of curriculum development, is this something that would ultimately have been done? Is it keyed into democracy, is the idea?
Well, at that time there was still a notion of curriculum development. Teachers were involved in curriculum development and shaping curriculum, learning strategies and so forth according to whatever it was that it was still possible to do that at that time. again, I put a book around it.
What was the book?
Breaking into the curriculum. Okay. And it was partly sort of inspired by the notion of computer technology and kids who used to break into the programs and change them for their own purposes. So I called it Breaking into the Curriculum. And so a notion of kids actually creating their own curriculum, deconstructing the structures within which they were working in order to be able to create something that was nice and interesting and fun for them to do. And by the way, literacy went up, numeracy went up.
Was that documented? Were you able to document it?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a PhD on it, carried out by one of the teachers in the school, and it's on the library shelves of the University of East Anglia.
Excellent. So fast forward 40 years to the SEAL programme and circle time in primary schools, chiefly, and I think secondary schools as well, and talking about social and educational aspects of learning. Is that a development of your project, democratic and nurturing, or is it something sinister and manipulative?
Well, it just depends on how it is, how deep it is. There's a political theorist called Chantal Mouffe, I don't know if you've come across her, and she basically says that, along with a number of other people, democracy is an unfinished and unfinishable revolution, such that you continually have to think of how the new inclusions are to take place. There's always another viewpoint. As Hannah Arendt put it, with every new baby there's a new viewpoint that has to be incorporated into what it now counts as the good society, within which that new voice, those new eyes are being inducted. So it is in terms of how far you push democracy. Democracy has to be, if it is going to be a lived and livable thing, has to be in every aspect of everyone's lives, whether it's in families, whether it's in schools, whether it's in face-to-face social work, on the streets or within community centres or whatever it happens to be. Democracy has to be lived and placed within those day-to-day interactions. Part of my issue is around how the public space that creates, public space is people voicing their viewpoints, not only just to be have their voice heard, but have their voices taken into account in the decision making and the changes that actually take place. That to me is the democratic full process. So that if you have a school council and all it is a voice for 5 minutes and then the head teacher decides whether it's useful or not useful, then that's not democracy. So it depends how it's being embedded. Things like freedom, things like partnership, these are universalizing words. They're empty words. They only mean something when you start to put the content into them. And the content is always contestable. So politicians might want this, but hey, I'm still using the word freedom and it is my choice to do this. So there's immediately a contest. So then it is about how does one create the public space within which all those contestable viewpoints can be heard and engage with each other and come to some kind of creative resolution or solution or accommodation or agreement to differ, however it turns out to be.
As the schools right now at the moment in the UK, on a scale of 0 to 100%, how democratic are they?
I would actually like to leave that as a question that people answer in their own hearts, as it were. So, people's experiences of schools, how many can they actually think of where the young people involved have a full and solid and deep experience of democracy? I would actually say my little school and another school we experimented with, because they agreed to do it with the same sort of principle.
You just discussed and did this research.
I would say they were moving very strongly towards democratic principles. The young children would be taking on enormous ranges of responsibility because they wanted to. In terms of the decisions that they were making and the actions that they were undertaking. And within one of the schools, the kids made a little video program to say, well, you know, the new kids coming in with the new parents will want to know how we do things here.
Okay.
So we're going to express it.
I mean, to answer your question, you know, I'll try and answer it myself, but do young people feel that they own the school? That's really a key question, isn't it? Do they feel it's their school, or it's an institution to which they've been placed where other people make the rules?
Yeah, I mean, we would actually have to carry out that research, wouldn't we? You can see, you know, my researcher kind of attitude coming out here. What I don't want to do is basically say, schools are this, or whatever. No, let's make this an open question such that people in the schools can make their own answers to that.
Okay. Do you think it's possible that schools can be democratic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you think it's possible at the moment? I'm just thinking of at least the new administration hasn't settled down, but under the last administration, schools became more prescriptive. Teachers had less autonomy. Absolutely. There was more centralised kind of prescription of the curriculum. And I would have thought, my impression is that schools, that despite a certain amount of voice to young people, kind of New Labour rhetoric, over the last 15 years have become less democratic. Yeah. Would you say, on the whole, that's true?
Well, let's say my feeling is that it is a supportable statement. And if you take, I think it's Michael Barber's book called The Instruction to Deliver, where he's talking about working with the Blair government in terms of, well, we know how to fix things. The task is to build the mechanisms and so forth that are going to deliver the modernisation agenda. So it's the instruction to deliver. And maybe we have our voices in terms of how to deliver that programme. But if you actually happen to have a dissenting view, is your voice going to be included in that programme? Almost certainly not, because the message hasn't got across, and we've got to, you know, get you to learn what the real message is and subscribe to it.
But to me, that puts it very clearly what was happening under New Labour. They felt they had the right vision and it was prescribed, but in doing so, other people's visions were not allowed. Yeah. And the problem with democracy is it should allow a lot of visions, even if they're not necessarily the right one.
Yeah. I mean, what we've got to really make a distinction between is democracy is not reducible to the state. Democracy and the state are not the same thing. So that when a state-sponsored politician is saying the democratic process is, no, the democratic process is people face to face, working things out together and using their individual powers in relationship to each other to accomplish things. So we need then to make a distinction between people's powers as individuals and as aggregates of individuals, as collectives of individuals, and power as it has been crystallized in terms of state mechanisms, corporate power, and so forth. There are two different things.
Absolutely. One of the things that struck me about the paper that I said, I think you said you didn't actually deliver the paper that I've read a copy of this morning, but in that you talked about how government is answerable to corporate interests, in part at least, and then the government mandates the educational curriculum to engineer consent. So even though we live in a democracy, in theory, the actual education that young people are receiving is something which has been manufactured by people with no interest in democracy at all.
Well,
and that's very simply, I'm aware.
Yeah, I mean, one can always begin to deconstruct those things and see the differences. No, my school is different. You know, this school is different, that school is different. Yes, and there's always going to be those differences. But you can look at the history. I think the BBC documentary, The Century of the Self, and I've given a website a reference to that, is quite stunning. Focusing upon the work of a guy called Bernays. Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and Bernays sort of brought Freud to America because Freud had to escape from, persecutions and so forth, or fears and whatnot, and basically made Freud famous in America. Bernays was a public relations guy. And he was one of the sort of pioneers of public relations. He helped to sell the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal. He also helped to sell cigarettes to women.
Is that emancipation?
Which was one of his major proud achievements. And that what he did was the owner of American Tobacco wanted to, saw that women weren't smoking in the street, but if they did, hey, sales would go up and we'd make more money. So he wanted someone to actually try to change people's viewpoints and so forth. So what Bernays did, he got a bunch of socialites who were well known and would grace the magazines and, instantly news media would come along and so forth. And on America, parade, I can't remember which parade it was, got all this together, and these socialites would, at a particular moment, take out their cigarettes and smoke. And this just went around the country. Sales went up. And the whole notion of the century of the self was kind of drawing upon those kinds of techniques and how they fed into the political system, and how Thatcher, Reagan, Blair and so forth are still employing those kinds of techniques in order, through focus groups and so forth, to pick up nice little ideas like the big society.
It all sounds sort of horribly corporate, doesn't it?
It sounds horribly corporate. How strong is it? Well, the plausibility of it.
You talk about amnesia, yeah?
Yeah.
Does that include democracy? Have we forgotten democracy?
Maybe we have. My feeling is the, I suppose, the hope, the excitement. There's got to be a different way that happened after the Second World War that brought in the welfare state and so forth, and increased participation and so forth. I think we've begun to forget that. And particularly the battle between the private and the public, which is becoming very, very urgent. You could see the battles, and they were quite real. If you talk about the Battle of Walgrave between the police and the miners was it 1984?
Early 80s, wasn't it?
Yeah. That was one sort of version of it. I think we're seeing another version of it now, in terms of whether it's in health, and you've got the movement away from primary care trusts to GPs being the focus of the new market for the National Health Service, or whether you're beginning to see the new free schools being sort of trotted out, with the possibility of free schools making. I have no objection, says Michael Gove, to the free schools being for profit.
Flagship, one of the 6, I believe it is, free schools that have been set up. They were seriously considering contracting out the running of it to, I think, Nord Anglia, or one of the large corporate educational providers, which seems to support exactly your argument that these are not free schools, these are something else.
Yeah, there's a relationship, I think, between democracy and the public, and the eating away of democracy by the private. As soon as you start to make something private, you are no longer committed to engaging in the multiple voices of a community, because Branson, or whoever it is who owns the company, the corporate entity, doesn't really need to listen to that many people. The whole machinery is about reducing the role of democracy in order to accumulate wealth. So the more that you privatise, my fear is the less democracy you're going to get.
Okay. But on the other hand, the state system under New Labour, as we just discussed, became increasingly prescriptive.
Sure. There's a wonderful writer called Alain Badiou, a French guy, did a lovely book called The Meaning of Sarkozy, where he was basically advocating, don't bother to vote, because, hey, do you want a red version of neoliberalism, or a green version of neoliberalism, or a yellow version of neoliberalism? It's all just simply a management team brought in to implement neoliberalism. Now, okay, maybe that's an extreme framework, but again, it's damn plausible to me. How different was the project of Thatcher, from Blair, from Cameron. Has anything significantly changed? Or is it just simply, better ways of instructing to deliver? In other words, new management coming in. There's another book which I'm kind of fond of at the moment by a French guy called Christophe Dejour, where he's looking at work and how work has been devalued and turned into just simply employment, where you're hired or fired. And his focus is on the question: how have we come to the position of tolerating the intolerable? So that within ordinary everyday work practices, people have become more and more isolated, and under the sort of neoliberal framework, new management thumb, the anxiety, the fear, and so forth is increased by the increasing demands for redundancy, for laying people off, for efficiency that effectively means whole ranges of jobs are just simply disappearing.
When you say that, that makes me see a parallel between this kind of efficiency, this rather heartlessness, and the sort of work is just what you do for money and no one really expects you to take any pride in it, kind of a version of work, with what's going on in schools, where the 45-minute packaged lessons, which and going back to your curriculum delivery, are the exact opposite of a democratically developed curriculum.
And continually measured. There are targets, there are measurements, there are tests, and so forth, so that every individual is in competition with every other individual, not in cooperation with people. I mean, the great thing that I loved about my little experiment in the first schools was the cooperative frameworks that kids began to develop in terms of mutual projects.
Yes. Is there any possibility of, where could democratic practices in education be realised at the moment in the UK? In the different possible contexts?
I can say where my hope is. And my latest hope is thinking this through with the Cooperative College, which is based here in Manchester. It's the College of the Cooperative Society.
You were talking about 100 cooperative schools, which until this morning I didn't even know existed.
The first cooperative trust school was Reddish Vale School, just outside Manchester here. And basically the idea was that school, people in that school felt that they weren't getting the kinds of resources that they wanted. They didn't want to go down the big business route of a big business corporation company or whatever it is, a local philanthropist could be, doing an academy school. They wanted some alternative. So the individual involved talked to the cooperative college, who kind of got interested, I suppose, in these ideas, and were already beginning to explore such.
John, sorry, what is the cooperative college?
The cooperative college is literally it's the college of the cooperative movement globally. It's starting with they've got the archives of Robert Owen all the way up to the present date. And working with people who wish to form associations that can come under a cooperative legal framework. Where there's going to be many different notions of what constitutes cooperative working practice. And obviously it's going to be down to the particular individuals who are forming that association as to what that's going to be. But at least there is notions of egalitarianism in terms of sharing of profits and so forth, if it happens to be a market-based trust. Or in the case of a school, it is about, well, how does the community and various organisations, cooperatively based organisations, not for-profit organisations, work with the school in order to be able to produce something that is somewhat different. Mm-hmm. Now, this is very, very early days. As I say, Reddish Vale is the first school, and just sort of Google it and you'll come up with the website. Uh-huh. Now, that is a model. There are now, I believe, Mervyn Wilson, who's the principal of the Cooperative College, told me that very shortly, or perhaps even now, there are 100 to 100 plus cooperative schools around the country, with an awful lot more on the way. And they're also rethinking in terms of how do we work with the free school agenda. And I think this is the interesting political framework that one can begin to play, is in terms of the task is to generate alliances. The task is to use the big motivating terms and to put the contents in under those terms. So if you're talking about big society, society is bigger than the state. Society is us, the people who compose it. The state only exists because we exist. Yeah. So that, you know, the state and society are not the same thing. So if we're talking about big society, then we've got to begin to define what that means. Not governments, but us. However, we do need to work collectively. Now, my optimism is the cooperative society has existed for quite some time now, and they were very resilient in the latest financial framework. So they've got something, they're here, and they're here to stay for an awful long time.
Demonstrated.
They've got an economic framework, they've got a health framework, they've got now a schools framework. Okay. Now, this is beginning to look like a sector, and a self-sustaining sector, which people can join and be part of.
So just to clarify, because people might not know, the cooperative schools are still funded through normal government funding?
So far as I understand it, and this is early days for me, I'm beginning to get to grips with it, so you know, don't sort of treat me as the absolute oracle on this. As I understand it, they are getting state funding, but they can also get other forms of funding if they can get hold of them, presumably.
And that could mesh into the Free Schools Initiative for education.
So far as I can see, there's no logical reason why it should not be able to mesh into the Free Schools framework.
So this ties back to something we talked about at the beginning, which is that you shouldn't take a blanket judgment, perhaps, on whether schools are anti-democratic or pro-democratic. That there are spaces, and it's up to you, to some extent, what you can create in those spaces. So the Free Schools movement, and more perhaps a bit more sort of strength behind this cooperative schools movement, is perhaps a space, at least.
This is a space. This is you know, three things have got to work together before you get the outcomes that you want. You've got to have the ideas and understand what your ideas and values are. You know, not surprisingly, mine are fairly democratic. You've got to have practices that articulate those democratic values and ideas and so forth. But those are not going to work alone. You've also got to have the resources, the material resources of people and, you know, the solid stuff and material, the tools and so
material
forth.
Resources is a thing which has come up frequently in defence discussions, because at the end of the day, the material resources for youth work are from the state, and the state gives them with a bunch of required outcomes.
So how do we think about getting our resources differently? I mean, people are resources. I mean, what I find absolutely staggering is that people. How do we think in terms of generating an economic framework such that people can generate their own work that is required to meet their needs?
Okay, so we're now broadening out into more a cooperative and democratic economy as well as a cooperative and democratic education.
That's right. So this is why I'm saying these things have to go together, because if they don't go together, they're going to fragment. You know, a simple example within the first school that I was talking about that tried the sorting out process and became a kind of very democratic framework. We did start off quite naturally by saying, what are our values as teachers? And they went through what their values were. We want children to be more self-reliant, to make their own decisions, to be creative, to be happy, to feel safe, and so forth. I remember sitting in the staff room, and a couple of teachers were coming in, and they were saying, you know, when the bell went at 10 o'clock and the children had to go to the hall for assembly because that was their structure, I got the kids to be hand in hand and sort of walk in a crocodile along the hallway, but we were a little bit early, and there were some classes that were still working, and I noticed that so-and-so and so-and-so at the back of the crocodile were talking rather loudly. So I said, be quiet. Mm-hmm. And she said, I did that all wrong, because if my values are, I want them to be self-responsible, self-reliant, and to work out, you know, the conditions under which they operate in everyday life, I shouldn't have done that at all. Mm-hmm. I should have asked them in some way or another how we might go about. So she was beginning to critique herself. And this is what I'm meaning in terms of the ideas have to be consistent with the practices. Mm-hmm. Now, what she discovered was she had her ideas and her values, but her practices weren't consistent with them. Mm-hmm. She had to find new practices. Mm-hmm. So those two things actually have to go together. If we want a democratic framework, a democratic community, we have to understand what practices are actually needed to articulate and bring into reality our democratic values and so forth. But if we don't have the material resources, if we're all sacked and put on the scrap heap and so forth, I guess not a lot of that's going to happen unless we can find another way of constructing material resources that are going to sustain ourselves. Now, maybe something like a cooperative organisation may begin to do that.
Okay, so the cooperative schools movement, how viable is that? Is it grown?
Well, as I say, there's about 100 now, and there's a lot more apparently that are looking into the details of how to do this. I'm hoping to, you know, work with the Cooperative College in order to get a couple of projects that are going to help.
Okay, so just
sustain this a little bit as well. So, you know, if you manage to get something like 400, 500, maybe 1,000 schools, that's a significant sector.
And these are schools which could do their own curriculum development, you're saying, so they're not tied to the national curriculum.
As I understand it, yes.
And they could, and another thing you talk about in your paper as well, was you're talking about them relating more to local needs and being more responsive to the local community rather than sort of rather distant, you know, the chain of command from the corporate and big government.
Well, who knows how the corporate framework is. The project I would love would be to have a study of the cooperative schools, a study of the academy schools, a study of the free schools, and make comparisons and contrasts to actually see what's going on here.
It does seem that they create a scope for experimentation, though, and for doing something different. And one of the things I've noticed, you know, in the mainstream sector, teachers, like social work and so on, there's this huge fear at the moment of doing anything out of line. There really is a very, you know, the prescriptiveness has become so great that showing individual initiative has really become difficult.
Well,
and this starts to create a space where this may be reborn.
Yeah, this may be the spaces that we require to give rebirth to that creative, to actually have the confidence again to be a little bit experimental. A little bit radical.
And not terrified that if you do, someone will lose a few pounds out of their profit margins somewhere. Yeah. It sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it does. Let's hope it works.
Excellent.